Excited to have you here. We are going to be talking about banking and bonds. Now you're probably going, oh, that's a snoozer. But when I tell you what's going on in the world, you're hearing all these headlines, you're hearing all these kinds of things about banks and all the financial issues that are going around the world that are reverberating all over the world. And a lot of you are saying, well, what's going on? And I want to spend some quality time to teach you how to do that, because part of your investing portfolio, your long-term investing, is with bonds. And remember, there's either one or two things you're going to do. You're either going to loan money to people or you're going to own things. You're either going to loan or own. And when you loan, then the goal is to be able to get a rate of return that's coming back. Now, you're seeing there's all kinds of challenges in America and other places around the world because of these banks are having some issues. Well, I'm going to tell you why they're having an issue and how it works, so that you feel like that you at least know what the game plan is. At least you know what's going on. That's all part of the game. Finance is a game, and games are fun. Bonds are fun. Money's fun. Business is fun, and is a game, and games are fun. So let's have a game with it, and I'm going to teach you how it all works. So now, when you think about that, there's a couple things I want to remind you about in our section here. But first of all, as we talk about loan versus own, you're either going to loan money to other people or you're going to own things. All right, you're going to loan versus own. So when you loan, that could be anything from loaning money to a family member or to someone else. You can do that on a personal loan. You can do that with the bank. Hey, when you take money down to the bank, guess what? You're loaning them money. Now, they're not very good at paying you back, very good interest rate, but that is part of what they do. You can do that on what we call a bond. Now, what's a bond? Well, a bond is a longer term loan. And there's all kinds of different bonds. Now, when you go to the bank, you can put it into your savings account. And you're probably going to get 0%, maybe 1% if you're lucky. They're going to take your money, and what's the bank doing? They're taking your money, and they're going to go make money with it. They're not just putting it in their vault and sitting around thinking that, hey, we're just going to put your money in the bank, it's sitting in the safe. They're taking your money, and they want to go make money with it. Believe it or not, they're taking your money. So you're loaning them money, and they're taking your money at 0 to 1%, and they're turning around and loaning it on a credit card at 21% plus fees, or a car, or an auto, or a house. That's what the bank is doing, is that they're taking your money, and this is you, and that's them. They're giving you 0 to 1%, and they're charging maybe 20%. Now, remember, the rule of 72 says, how long does it take for something to double in value or double in cost? Well, if you're making a 1% return, you take the number 72, and 1 goes into 72 times, or 1 times 72 equals 72. It takes literally 72 years for your money in the bank to double. It takes 72 years. If you're getting a 0% rate of return, then it's even worse than that. It never does. If you're getting a 3% rate of return, 3 times some number, in this case, it happens to be 24, equals 72. If you're getting a 3% rate of return, it takes 24 years for your money to double. So if you put your money into a bank, that's what's happening. Now, look at the bank side of it. If they're taking your money and they're doubling and they're charging 21%, 21 times 3, it's actually 3.4, equals 72. So it takes 3.4 years. 3.4 years for them to take your money and double it. So when I go to these big investment conferences, they talk about doubling your money, the multiplier effect. How long does it take to double your money? So if they're getting a 21% rate of return, it takes about 3.4 years. If they're getting a 6% rate of return, 6 times some number, in this case it happens to be 12, equals 72. So it takes 12 years to double your money. If they're getting a 10% rate of return, 10 times 7.2 equals 72. It takes 7.2 years. So part of what we are seeing here is that the banks are taking your money. They're taking your money and they're going out and they're making more money with it. Many of the times, though, is that they're taking that money and they're buying other kinds of bonds. They're just like you're loaning them money into your savings account. They're taking that money and taking it and reloaning it out. And many times they're doing that with what we call bonds, where they're getting a shorter rate of return. So with a bank, you can put it into savings. You can put it into what we call a CD, or a certificate of deposit, anything that's a little bit longer term. And it might be 1% to 2% that you're going to get, maybe even 3%, depending on the term. How long is it? You know, if it's a short term, it's going to be a much lower rate interest. If it's a longer term, you're going to get a higher rate of interest. Now, that takes us to what we call a bond. So I want to talk about bonds here in the next section. But the big thing I want you to understand is that bank is taking your money. The bank is taking your money and they're going to go invest it. They're taking your money and they're going to make money on you. They didn't put it in the safe. It's not in 10s and 20s. It's not in cash. They didn't put it in the safe and lock it up. They're loaning it out to someone else because they're in that business. They're in the business of making money. That's what they do. And as a result, your money is at risk. Now in America, we have insurance that covers to a certain amount, but that's what they're doing. So just be aware of that. So when you walk into the bank, don't feel stupid. You know, everybody feels stupid when they walk into the bank. They feel, you feel all kinds of things. But just realize it's your money that they're loaning out. Oh, wow. So I'm actually loaning them money. What kind of rate of return are you going to get on it? Now, it's okay to get a small rate of return because that's part of what you're trying to do with your asset allocation and other pieces. But let's go to the next section. I want to talk to this section right here, which is on the bonds. And for me, the bonds are longer term, usually 1 to 10 years. Okay, now that's what we call a bond. So let's flip over the page and let's go over to bonds. Now, when we talk about a bond, and this is where a lot of the challenges that are happening around and all these banks. So you're loaning money to the bank and the bank is taking that money and loaning out to someone else. But I want to tell you about one other thing that's kind of crazy. So you take money, this is you, and you take money to the bank, and let's say that you loan them $100. Okay, so you put $100 in the bank. The way that these governments around the world work is they have what they call fractional lending. So what that really means is you think that the bank can only loan out $100. That's not true. They can loan 10 times that amount or $1,000 to individuals for cars, for scooters, for houses, you know, whatever that is, they're going to loan that money out. They're going to take your 10, but they can 10 times it. It's just part of what they call fractional banking. And so $100 in the bank really turns into $1,000 worth of loans. Now, some of that money that they're sitting on, they're not going to loan it out. It's just they don't have that many loans. And so they put it into other kinds of bonds. Now, a bond, of course, is a little bit longer. It's about 1 to 10 years. And that's what a bond is. And there's different kinds of bonds that are out there. There are ones that are secured by the government. And I'll just talk about the United States because we have people from all over the world, but there are ones that are secured by the government. Okay. There's also ones that are secured by other assets, like businesses, where you're loaning money to big operations and businesses. You can loan money to a school, to build a school. You can loan it to corporations. But really, it's the government bonds that we're going to be talking about here for just a minute. So they're taking your money, this $100, they're 10 timesing that with fractional banking. They can loan out up to 10 times that amount or up to $1,000, and they're doing it over here. But for most of the time, they have to keep a small reserve. And some of that they're loaning out here, but some of that they're just putting in and getting a better rate of return. So they're taking the money from you at 1% or 0 to 1%, and they're actually putting it over here into bonds. And let's say you've got a 1 year and a 10-year bond. This is the number of years. And right now, let's just say that they're getting about a 3.5% rate of return. Okay, so they're taking your money at a low amount, and when they're putting it into a bond, they're getting a higher rate of return. Now, the issue is what happens to that bond? What happens to the value of a bond? That's really kind of interesting. So that's what I'm going to talk about next. So I want to make sure you get this concept. This big multiplier effect is what really can get banks and organizations in trouble, because they're not only just taking your $100 that's in your bank account, but they're 10 timesing that. Okay. And many of the governments around the world, as they are printing more money, because guess what? The countries around the world, the governments around the world can't pay their bills. They can't pay their bills. So what do? They print more money. That's all they're doing, is they're printing more money. Back in the early days, after World War II, they took all the gold, as much gold as they could get around the world, and the whole world was in shambles because of World War II. And they said, well, where's a safe place to put that? And America said, hey, we're safe. And so they grabbed all this gold, and they took the gold and they put it in America, and they exchanged that for a dollar bill. So you have money in gold, but it's backed by a dollar bill. So that's why that it had security, it had collateral. But what happened was that in America, we couldn't pay our bills. We got into a war in Vietnam and other things like that. And what happened is that we started printing more money than we had gold in reserve. And these other countries around the world start coming back to us and say, hey, we want our gold back. Here's the money that we exchanged it for. We want our gold back. And America didn't quite have enough of that. So Richard Nixon in 1974 took us off what they call the gold standard. And he said, now it's not backed by gold. It's backed by the good faith of the United States. It's not collateralized. What that means is there's nothing behind it except for the good word and faith of the United States that they'll pay you the money. That's like you loaning money to a friend and you have no collateral. Now, if you loan some money to buy a car and they don't pay it, then you can get the car back. If you loan money against a house and you don't pay, well, they're going to say, oh, well, I get the house back. That's collateralized. There's something that's backing it up. So that's kind of what's happening right now. So what I want to do is I want to get into what's happened with these banks. But the big thing I want you to understand is that multiplier effect. Okay, that multiplier effect. The other thing is that the countries of the world, not only are they taking your money, but the governments need money. So they actually print money. And what do? They give it to the banks. So not only are you putting money into the bank, but the government's putting money into the bank. And then they're 10 timesing it more so that there's more and more money out there. Now, the reason we say all these, I want you to understand it, is that that's how really good economic times can happen, but can also be where things get into trouble. So now I want to teach you about bonds a little bit and what happens with bonds. Now, you hear all this crazy stuff that's going around the world and Silicon Valley Bank and these other banks and stuff like that, but I'm going to tell you how they got into trouble. So they took money from depositors. So they took money from you and from the government, we'll say. Because they got money from the government. It might have been secondhand, but they got money from the government. And they're paying out a percentage to you. And they're paying out a 1 to 2% to you, or zero. Most of the time it's 0%. They're not paying you anything. But they took that money and they made loans out on it. But the extra cash, they made loans, but a bunch of that they had extra, so they invested it in bonds. Okay, so longer term. Now, the deal is that if you have a bond, and let's say that I'm just going to use easy math, it has $100 on it, and it gets a 3% rate of return over a 1 year period of time, that will produce $3. So if you took $100 and bought a bond, or it doesn't matter how it works, if you loaned it to the bank, if you loaned $100 to the bank and they gave you 1%, you'd make $1. If you got a 2% rate of return, you'd get $2. So in this case, these big banks right here, this is the bank, loaned some of it out to organizations, but the rest of it they took and put it into long-term bonds. And they put $100 in at 3%, which gives them 3% over a year's period of time. Now, for the last 10 years, interest rates have been artificially low. They've been artificially low. And the governments get to play all these kinds of games where they can increase the interest rates or lower the interest rates or whatever. But the problem you run into is that you've got a 3% rate of return. For a long time, this $100 bond was only given about a 1% rate of return, or $1. So here's the problem, and here's what happens. If you have a bond that's $100 at 1%, and it's got 3 years to run on it. Now, if you just stick it there and you leave it there and you never ask for the money, so you say, hey, I'm going to put my money in, we're going to leave it there. The term of that bond is 3 years. You're going to get your interest rate, and you're going to get 100% of your money, 100 cents on the dollar. You're going to get it all. I loaned you $100. You're going to pay me $3 every year. And at the end of that 3 years, I'm going to give you back all your $100, and you've already made the interest. Okay. So as long as they just stay there and don't do anything, that works out great. But the problem is that a lot of times they put these on a 3-year or a 10-year basis. So they were investing in a longer term at a low interest rate. I'm going to show you kind of a par example on that. But the problem is that interest rates went up. Okay, so interest rates have gone up. And I'm just going to show you a big example of that. Interest rates went up to, let's say, 5%. And again, the reason I'm showing this is I want you to understand the difference. Okay, so that same $100 at 5% would produce a $5 rate of return. Okay, so this is where it was a few months ago. The governments of the world are saying, hey, inflation is happening. This is why we have to do the 5 steps. This is why we have to do step number 4. We have to automatically invest. We have to invest in things that go up in value. Real estate goes up in value. Long-term stock goes up in value. Why does it go up in value? Well, one is because hopefully you're making more money. But number 2 is they're watering down the milk. They're printing more and more money so they can pay their bills. And as a result, it makes everything go up in cost. So if you own things, we appreciate it because it's appreciating, and we appreciate that. If it's not, then it's inflation and it's hurting you. So who does this really hurt? Inflation. It hurts the people that do not have the assets. The Warren Buffetts of the world, the Jeff Bezos, they have assets. They have stock. And so they're making more and more money, but it's the guy who does not have the assets is the one that's getting crushed. So here's the rub. Here's what's happening. So now these guys are only getting a 1% for on there, making $1. They kick up the interest rates and say, well, the new bonds we're putting out there is getting a 5% rate of return. The federal government the Federal Reserve just changes the interest rate, and these are getting a 5%. So really, what is that bond really worth? What's it really worth? In order to create $5, you would have to have $500 at 1% to equal that same $5 of interest. Okay, so this is the rub. This is the problem. If they kick up that interest rate, the same $1 was getting you 1% that produced $1. Now the market is saying, hey, we can get 5% on stuff. And so you would have to have $500 to produce that same 1%. So what does that really do? It makes this bond worth less money because you can get a higher rate of return. And so this bond doesn't look nearly as good, okay? Because it's not equivalent. Nobody wants this one, they want this one. And as a result, they have what they call runs on the bank. And so when organizations are fearful, they start withdrawing their money. Now, like I said, the bank does not have, they have their money out tied up in loans, they have it in bonds, and they have some cash. Okay, I'll just put cash right there. They have cash, but they don't have very much of it. It's all tied up here and here, and they have a little bit of money. But when there's a whole bunch of people saying, hey, I want our money out, we need our money, I want our money, they don't have enough of it. So what do they have to do? They have to come down here and they have to sell their bonds, and their bonds aren't worth as much. So instead of being worth $1, now it's only worth 50 cents or 20 cents. So the value of that bond goes down. Now, if they said these people, hey, you can withdraw, but you can't withdraw for 3 years, nothing happens. Hey, you can't do it. You've got to stick it in there because that's where these bonds are. But that's not the deal. The deal is, this is cash. I want my cash. They don't have enough cash. Those they have to sell. They have to sell their bonds. They have to sell their bonds to somebody else. And the bonds have lost value because the interest rate is so low that, hey, it's only worth like 50 cents now, or it's only like worth 20 cents. And so as a result, they're selling these bonds and taking a loss. Okay. So they bought them for $1, their cost in it. Hey, we bought these for $1. We invested these for $1. We had to sell for 50 cents. That means we've took a loss of 50 cents on it. Now, multiply that by commas. Instead of 100, now you got 100 million or a billion. Massive, massive numbers. People are withdrawing their money. We don't have enough cash. We have to sell what we have. We got to sell our bonds, but we have to sell them at a discount because the rates are higher now than what we're into. And so they have to take a loss, and that means that the company lost money. And when the company loses money, then the stock goes down. What's the real value? What's the real value of any asset? Well, when you listen to Buffett, he says the reason that you buy a farm is because when you buy a farm, you pay a price and then it makes money. And I'll give you a little example of that. And I'm going to show you one of the first ones that he did that will really reiterate this. It was See's Candy. Okay, it was See's Candy. Now, See's Candy is a candy store, and they had a price of approximately $25 million was the purchase price. That's what they could buy it for, is $25 million. But it made $5 million a year in profit. Okay, so they bought it for $25 million. They had a $5 million profit. That means it took 5 years of profits to pay for it. Okay, so they spent $25 million. It made $5 million. It took 5 years to make a profit. The higher the profit, the more valuable. So the value of that company went up, 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 and up. Because not only did that, they increased the gross sales. Now, where did he learn this technique? Can you remember me talking about can you remember when we talked about Warren Buffett was just a kid and he was selling Coca-Cola? When he was just a young guy, he went to his grandfather, and one of the things he knew that Coke outsold anybody else. And so he made a deal with his grandpa. He would buy a 6-pack, 6 drinks for 25 cents. And then he would sell them for a nickel each. So he would sell them for nickel each and just brought in 30 cents. Okay. So this is what I'm telling you. Just add zeros and commas. So he bought his product for 25 cents. He sold it. That was his cost. He sold it for 30 cents. And he made a 5-cent profit. Okay. Which means he made a 20% rate of return on his investment. He spent 25 cents and he made 5 cents. It's just 20%. Oh my gosh, look at this. There's See's Candy, which is one of the first ones that he did. And it's got that same 20% rate of return. He just added commas and zeros. But the other thing that they did is they took that company and that was doing whatever it is, and they increased the gross revenue, they increased the sales, and now the profits made them billions of dollars. Okay, but now going back to this one, why is that so important? Well, because the bank was taking a loss on its portfolio. It had stuff in there for $1, it had to sell it for 50 cents, and it lost money. As it loses money, the value of the stock goes down. See's Candy kept going up because what did they do? They took their profits and they did more sales. And they did more sales, which made them more money, which made them more money. So that one little investment right here, which paid for itself over the period of time, is the same thing. So we look at that basically with real estate. We look at it with businesses. We look at it with anything, is what's the rate of return? Now, you're saying, well, how does that affect all of this? Well, that's what's happened to these banks. People wanted their money out. They said, hey, give us our money. The bank didn't have the money, so it had to sell its assets. It had to sell its assets at a loss, which means that the bank was losing money and people were losing confidence because they were worried that there wasn't going to be enough money in there. And so what did the government do? The government walked in there and says, hey, we're going to guarantee that money. We're going to guarantee that bank. but the stockholders of the bank are going to lose. Okay. The people who loaned the money, who had the money in the accounts, were going to make sure that they get their money back. But the owners of the bank, the stockholders of the bank, get wiped out. This is why we don't usually pick and choose. We don't just pick one stock over the other one. We put it into a big asset with 500 companies, because that's not going to happen to 500 companies. It's going to happen to maybe a very small amount. But those are the ones that you hear about when you're listening to this on the news. So now, how does that affect you? You're probably saying, well, how does that affect me? Well, remember, when we talked about a long-term bond, as long as you keep it there for that 3 years, you're fine. So if part of your portfolio, as you look at your asset allocation, okay, you're either going to loan or own. You're going to do one of those two things. And when you're loaning, you're going to have short term. I'm just going to say short term, and I'm going to use long term. So you're going to have short term, and then you're going to have long term. And so you might be doing a 1 year to a 3 year bond. And as long as you leave it there, you're going to get whatever interest rate that they promise you they're going to pay you. You're going to get all your money back plus all of your interest. Okay. But that is all part of your asset allocation. So as long as you don't sell it, you're just fine. So that's the real big difference in what we're doing. That's what's happening around the world. And interesting, when they sold those bonds, somebody bought them. Okay, so for every buyer, there's a seller. And so somebody bought those bonds. So Silicon Valley Bank sold their bonds, but somebody had to buy them. And so somebody bought them, but they bought them at a big discount. So is that a great return for them? So that's kind of how that world works. And so one of the things is, over the long period of time, everybody's worried about the whole market collapsing. Well, a lot of people that are saying those things are the people that are trying to get you to watch whatever they're saying. They're selling advertising, they're selling something. And yes, can the marketplace have a big problem? You can just go back and study history. Study Ray Dalio. He really talks about history, and he's looked over history of what's happened. And you look back to World War II, you look back at all these things, because history repeats itself. History repeats itself. So you just got to learn what's happening in history. The big takeaway for me is, and again, I'm not telling you what to do with your money, is that I'm interested where you're going to be in 10 years from now. The whole marketplace isn't going to collapse, and we're all not going to go back to trading animals and bartering for food and everything else. The governments of the world will do something different. They will print more money. They will do whatever it is. And the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, because the rich own assets that keep up in value. They keep up with inflation. And the poor do not have any of those things. So we're trying to change that. That's why it's so important that you do long-term investing. Now, will the value of your stocks go down? Yeah. Will the value of your bonds go down? Yeah, they will. I'm not interested where they are this year. I'm interested where they're going to be in 10 years from now. Okay, so that's why we're so passionate about what we're teaching. And if you can get a small business and you can continue to build this business when there are problems out in the marketplace, many of your competitors have problems and they have too much inventory, so they've got to sell it, and you can buy it at a discount. We're playing a game. We're playing the game of money, and games are fun. Business is a game and games are fun. Investing is a game and games are fun. So have fun with it. Watch it. You can watch it as a spectator, or you can jump in and be part of the action itself. You can do either one of those two things. So that's what's happening with bonds. Stay tuned. We're going to come back and we're going to be talking about the 5 F's of financial freedom and what you've got to do anytime to be able to make more money. Be right back in just